So I'm really pleased to introduce our panel. Again, the name of this session is Early Learning from the Community-Centric Fundraising Movement, which is focused on fundraising. How do we do it? The need to reevaluate how we do it, and how we can reshape it using a systems lens with an eye towards social justice and economic justice. Our panelists and real experts of living into this work is Rachel DeSouza-Siebert, founder and principal of Gladiator Consulting, David Dwight IV, executive director and lead strategy catalyst of Forward Through Ferguson, and LadyAshley Gregory, director of community partnerships of Forward Ferguson, and also the grandniece of the late civil rights activist Dick Gregory. With that, I will turn it over to you, Rachel, and thank you, the three of you, for doing this and being here with us.
Thank you, Dan. It's wonderful to be here today as well. I also just need to say how excited I am to talk about that video in therapy on Thursday. It was incredible. So I'm like pinging that for my mental health care later this week. So as Dan shared, my name is Rachel DeSouza-Siebert. I wear a lot of hats. I'm the founder and principal of Gladiator Consulting, as well as the Justice Philanthropy Catalyst for Forward Through Ferguson here in St. Louis, Missouri, which is home to the Osage, Illini, and Kickapoo nations. With Forward Through Ferguson, we actually had the opportunity to start working with community-centric fundraising principles back in 2017, when Vu Le's first article, The 9 Principles of Community-Centric Fundraising, came out back in 2017. I'm actually going to drop a couple links in the chat for you. It was really that article, along with a piece that was featured in the Stanford Social Innovation Review, that really informed the fundraising work of Forward Through Ferguson over the last 4 years. So as Dan shared, the formal launch of community-centric fundraising as a movement happened last summer, 2020 in July. There was a group of fundraisers out of Seattle, Washington, who put some effort behind a movement. And so community-centric fundraising is a fundraising model and a movement that is grounded in equity and social justice. It is a movement and a model that prioritizes the entire community over individual organizations, fosters a sense of belonging and interdependence, allows us to present our work not as individual transactions, but as holistic, and encourages mutual support between nonprofit organizations. So over the course of the last year, and especially if you've been on Twitter, there have been some pretty spicy conversations about community-centric fundraising. Does it work? Does it raise money? Does it actually bring equity to fundraising? Is it harmful to donors? And so I'm thrilled to share the work that Forward Through Ferguson has done over the last 4 years, building a resource development model for a nonprofit organization that really centers these principles. So I'm happy to now ask some questions to my colleagues, David and LadyAshley. And David, we're going to start with you so you can kind of set the stage for this work. So tell us a little bit about Forward Through Ferguson and how and why some of the aspects of traditional fundraising didn't really serve the organization as it was getting started, and why community-centric fundraising seemed like a movement that you wanted to join or a practice that you wanted to try.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that, Rachel. So, hey, everybody, David Dwight. I'm the executive director of Forward Through Ferguson. I've been with the organization since its founding 5 years ago, 5.5 years ago now, and a decade-long resident of St. Louis, Missouri. So to know about Forward Through Ferguson, you have to understand the legacy that came before us. And that comes in the form of the Ferguson Commission, which was this governor-appointed commission by Governor Nixon at the time in Missouri, that was only created because of an enormous community uprising that happened after the murder of Michael Brown Jr. in Ferguson, Missouri. And it's from those 100 plus stretching into a year straight of protests, applying pressure to these systems and saying, no more, something has to change beyond just fixes on the surface. And it's through the creation of that commission and the incredible diverse set of people that were put in charge of it that really said, hey, it's not just about us, it's about the community. And we're going to create an open process where there's over 70 public meetings, over 3,000 community members are going to be at these open meetings, and we're going to develop these deep policy calls to action, engaging with the trauma of this moment to create and innovate on what we could imagine for our community to be different. But not just those calls to action in a report, but really like, what's the heart set for the work, right? What are those principles of racial equity and anti-racism that we have to live into, because the process often is just as important as the outcome when it comes to anti-racism. And so from the beginning, they really understood themselves in this tradition of commissions that had often just gathered dust on a shelf after they finish. And St. Louis also saw themselves in this history of being the home of a number of milestones of the United States systemic racism, from the Dred Scott case to Shelley v. Kramer, the Supreme Court case, and a number of other decisions. And so when they created this report, they were like, we have to make sure that there's ongoing infrastructure so that this doesn't gather dust on a shelf. And that's where they ended up, through a community process, creating Forward Through Ferguson, a nonprofit organization to continue on the work. And they knew through some of their analysis that there were a variety of things that come with being a nonprofit, knowing the history of how this model was created and all that comes with it, with the funding structures and the nonprofit industrial complex, but ultimately settled on this being the way to get it started and keep things moving. And so presciently, they set aside 2 years of funding for FTF. They underspent what had been allocated, and we would not have survived without that money, because sadly, we did not reach the budget that they imagined would be necessary to carry on this groundbreaking swell of community process and democratic process that created the recommendations. And unfortunately, we didn't reach that budget that they knew was needed for the work until 4.5 years into our existence as a nonprofit. And that came from a variety of all the factors we're going to talk about later in this panel, and the realities that many of you all likely know about what is prioritized within philanthropy, what voices are listened to and seen as authorities, and what communities, and also what types of changes are put into practice. So I'm going to give a few examples of some of the BS that we went through in our first couple of years as Forward Through Ferguson, when I came on as a staff person, and I didn't become the exec director until 2 years ago. But it included things like the Regional Business Council here in St. Louis reimagining commitments when it was inconvenient to them. So when it was good for them to show face, to make a commitment, but then when it came to the work, actually reneging and retracting a gift that had been committed to the organization, which I'm sure for many of you all that work at nonprofits know the hell that can put up for leaders trying to do the work day in, day out. We had a major corporation advocacy organization made up of the top CEOs of corporations in St. Louis take advantage of the Forward Through Ferguson and the Ferguson Commission name, as well as the names of some of the Black and brown leaders of the commission, to instead invest money exclusively into direct service that really just address the symptoms of the problems that they continue to uphold in some of their labor practices and other policies that they were supporting at the state level in Missouri. And a third example is a major private foundation actually repurposed a program plan that we had built, funded ourselves because we couldn't find philanthropy to invest in this kind of community-based solution, leaving us in a holding pattern that led to a huge amount of turbulence in our staff, and a series of, I've been in a lot of boardrooms, a lot of spaces, heard a lot of racist things, but a series of the most patronizing, ageist, racist conversations I've ever experienced as a nonprofit leader, that really showed like a lack of respect for the community work that was happening, the community voice that were raising up these priorities, and honestly led us at Forward Through Ferguson to make decisions to not even solicit funding from this major foundation anymore. But we were able to survive really because of having to innovate through those barriers and challenges that we faced, really building up a community of individual donors, less than $1,000, and also some foundation support for some key relationships that really believed in this kind of anti-racism systems-oriented approach to dismantling white supremacy and systemic racism, and really trying to make sure that we're saying, like, we are not going to be part of the power dynamics of traditional fundraising that aren't serving the mission that we've been charged with, or the vision that community members raised up. And so we'll talk about it a little bit more later, and I'll kind of cede some of my time, but it all went into this hashtag SDL 2039 action plan, and this idea of sustaining the work, knowing and seeing ourselves in that legacy of this generational fight for racial equity, and saying we're gonna attack the problem with that same level, that same level of intention. And so we started to build a development plan and a theory of change that really centered this as principle number one, that fundraising has to be grounded in race analysis, and racial equity, and in social justice. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like in practice, and how we were able to survive and then thrive as an organization because of it.
Thank you for that, David. So my next question is for LadyAshley. So when you look at the community-centric fundraising principles, the second principle states, individual organizational missions are not as important as collective community, which is hard, right, for nonprofits, because we are taught about our budget being the bottom line, that fundraisers have to get those dollars in the door, and the minute the fiscal year is over, right, we have to start hustling, right, for more dollars, so we can keep our lights on and pay our bills. So I want you to tell us a little bit about the ways in which Forward Through Ferguson has sort of challenged a little bit of those more traditional notions, and really leaned into this idea that when collective community approaches things with an asset-based mindset, that we have the opportunity to really start to see what change looks like.
I would love to, Rachel. Yes. I think I have to tell you all that I actually fell into this job as a community organizer who found my voice and identity during the Ferguson uprising. So collective community holds my heart. And Forward Through Ferguson really does a great job at modeling this belief of collective community. One example that I have for you is our annual fundraiser. It's called Partners in Change. We shifted our whole annual fundraiser. It started as a fundraiser, and then we realized and we acted from a place of acknowledging that we did not need to hoard resources. During a double pandemic where we were fighting an airborne virus, asymptomatic airborne virus, and when we were fighting for the justice of Black and Brown community members all over, specifically continuing in the St. Louis region, we chose to redistribute the funds from our fundraiser out to smaller organizations that are doing amazing work in their sectors, such as Generate Health, Action St. Louis, Dream Builders for Equity, We Power, and we aided them in continuing to do their work. Reciprocity, y'all, it's important. And also in partnership with Deaconess Foundation and Missouri Foundation for Health, we launched the St. Louis Regional Racial Healing and Justice Fund. This fund, y'all, is my joy. I call it my joy. It is a fund that makes it a priority that residents who are directly affected by racial inequity are the ones who design the strategy and govern the investments into the community of those funds. We collaborated with national funder Robert Wood Johnson Foundation in the creation of the Racial Healing and Justice Fund. We also assembled the Community Governance Board. We belovedly call them our CGB. They are a group of folks, of community members and advocates who are directly impacted by racialized oppression. The Community Governance Board, or our CGB, is made up right now of Black community members and is open to Black and Brown community members from the St. Louis region who oversee the fund's investment. So Forward Through Ferguson does not benefit from the Racial Healing and Justice Fund. All the money that has been raised from the fund goes directly back into community. But this work aligns with our mission and the 189, yes, there's 189 calls to action within the Ferguson Commission report that helps align our work within racial equity and justice.
Thank you for that. I mean, I think the thing that will always stand out for me is that success for this nonprofit organization is not making a budget. And quite frankly, in the early days, we weren't making budget anyway, right? There was not enough philanthropic relationships that felt that we were the right investment, in that sort of traditional grant making way or traditional giving way, that they wanted to resource the work. And so for, Lady Ashley, you now to be in a position where we have been able to organize other funders around this idea that there is healing that needs to happen in this community. Before we can get right to the 189 calls to action, right, there are other steps that need to happen for us to be able to sort of live into the vision of the Ferguson Commission. Okay, so some real talk. Principle number 6 states that we treat donors as partners, and this means that we are transparent and occasionally have difficult conversations. This is really where a lot of the heartache around the ideas of community-centric fundraising come from, right? So if we have a model of philanthropy, if we look at the current model of US philanthropy and we see the white supremacy and patriarchy that has informed it, what does it mean for us to bring in principles of community-centric fundraising? What does it mean for us to move away from this idea that the donor is right or the donor is always centered, and really actually live into centering community? Has transparency, has honesty with donors harmed the donor relationships that Forward Through Ferguson engages in? And David, I'll have you start there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think on the whole, it has not harmed us. It's actually really benefited us and grown the number of connections and relationships and people that feel deeply bought into the mission. That's not to say that there aren't some relationships that didn't work out because of a lack of that mutualism and commitment to living into these priorities. But I think we came from this abundance mentality that there will be more opportunities than the ones that aren't a right fit because of those principles. And so I think it totally connects to what you were saying and about the fund. It's like, and the healing before getting to these policy calls to action is that like the how we show up matters so much, right? Like we were expected to just check the box on policy calls to action, but it was really about how we invest in relationships, how we think about mutualism, how we think about healing from racialized trauma that actually would assure the success of our community in the long run, and like break out of, because it is kind of like capitalist kind of thought, right? It's like a focus on the product, on the profit, on the outcome, versus the like, or instead of the process, when we can hold both of them. And so when it comes to our relationships with donors, like Principle 6, we really like do our best to be transparent and upfront at the beginning of our relationships, and really think intentionally about what it means to set the table for that kind of productive relationship, because philanthropy can be really tricky. There are a lot of kind of unseen, unwritten agreements, assumed rules of engagement about what you are and are not allowed to do that often are to the benefit of those with the resources and to the detriment or to constrain those that might be doing the work in community. And so it was really important for us to take time to unlearn and dismantle these practices, not just ourselves, but with our funders and with individual donors on up to foundations and larger dollar donors. And we have a couple examples of that. So kind of after the sunsetting of one of those business advocacy organizations that I mentioned previously, a new organization started to form in St. Louis called Greater St. Louis Incorporated. And there's commitments to try and be different and to move past those things, to think about inequities in our economy and center racial equity. And it's also meant that we have to show up not just with partnership, but with pressure, right? So much, it's like a binary. You're either like at the partnership table, which I think is where a lot of nonprofits are pushed to, right? You just have to be nice, you have to show up, you have to like have the suit and tie and be very professional. or you're pressure, like you're an activist in the street. And we think both those models can have place, but we can have them together. And we think if we're unflinching in our work, then we are having accountability that means both pressure and partnership. And so even as we were collaborating with them on the St. Louis Racial Equity Summit, we were still able to hold to account on a big jobs plan that they were releasing. And so we had our own public release, kind of talking about where the jobs plan fell short, where it needed to improve. If it was really going to meet what community had been calling for, people of color, Black people have been calling for. And another example that's been super exciting is our partnership with the Robley Foundation here in St. Louis, where they engage in some racial equity capacity, anti-racism capacity building opportunities that we partnered on. And from that, their board actually started to shift some of their funding priorities and reimagine what their giving looked like in the wake of Ferguson and all the learnings about systemic racism from that. And it's really incredibly beautiful, their willingness to like lean into abundance, to lean into trying new things and taking risks. And so it's been great to see some of those evolutions in philanthropy. But enough for me. Like Rachel, I actually would love to hear like from you, and like Rachel's served as our Justice Philanthropy Catalyst for 3.5 out of the 5 years, or 4.5 out of the 5.5 years. And so it's been really beautiful to work with you and to feel your fire, you know, for changing the way these relationships happen. Like, how have you seen it play out?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, you've spoken a lot about sort of the institutional relationships that we have, but, you know, there are 2 million people living and working across the St. Louis region who, after the murder of Michael Brown, amongst many very public, tragic losses of Black lives, have been trying to figure out where they fit into this. And so I think for me, being able to connect with individuals in a space where I'm not pushed to value the size of their donation as much as the fact that they chose to give, or the fact that they had a Facebook fundraiser for us, or the fact that they asked people to donate for so-and-so's birthday. You know, those are things that are meaningful, and they're meaningful to, I think, a new generation of donors who are trying to figure out what charity and philanthropy mean to them. And so for us to be able to give them a space and celebrate how they choose to share their wealth with us, that's been pretty awesome for me. But, you know, I think on the flip side of it, I think what has been tough for me is that when we have been honest and transparent about who we are and the work we're trying to do, there have been situations where there are entities with funds and we are not able to build those relationships, whether there are gatekeepers involved or, you know, nervous shareholders. I mean, I think it was probably about a year ago that, you know, St. Louis-based company Enterprise Holdings made this like sweeping announcement that they were going to pledge $135 million or something dollars to racial equity over a 5-year period, which is incredible. And then when you start to try to build those relationships or make those connections, because that's the work that, you know, Forward Through Ferguson and a lot of other grassroots nonprofits are in, those more traditional ideas of philanthropy trickle in, like, well, who's on your board, and what are the actual programs you're doing, and tell us about your outcomes. And, you know, that's been so frustrating to me. I think, you know, there was also that article that came out a few weeks ago in the Associated Press about the fact that a lot of people found it convenient to say very publicly last year that they were going to put all this money towards Black and Brown led organizations or Black and Brown centered organizations with this sort of goal of supporting racial equity. But for all the talk that has happened, we haven't seen it in St. Louis. And it's clear to me that our peers around the country who are leading a variety of different kinds of organizations haven't seen, you know, that very public wealth transfer happen? And that's hard. I mean, that's probably the piece that keeps me up at night. Like, how do we move the wealth from where it is, from people who are saying that they want to move it into organizations who are doing this work, not just for a year or 2 years, but, you know, as David mentioned, there's a STL 2039 plan. Like, we are looking at the generation after Mike Brown's murder and trying to figure out how do we move an entire region in the direction of racial equity. And that isn't going to happen simply because we have the donors that we have now. Lady Ashley, do you have anything to add there?
I think that's beautiful. I think it's about really naming what we see and how it's not been working. So I think you all covered it really great. And I think being honest and acknowledging the root of the issues and how we're addressing it and how we're saying no more to these things is the only step forward.
Awesome. All right. So I have 2 more questions for these folks, but definitely want to make sure that we have time for your questions. So if you haven't dropped anything in the Q&A, please do that. We are honest. We love to spill some tea. So we're happy to continue the real talk. Okay. So next question. Can you talk a little bit about some of the successes that we've had with community-centric fundraising, or which of the principles have sort of been exciting or easy to live into? And Lady Ashley, I'll go ahead and start with you.
Oh, exciting. I won't say easy because I don't think they've all been easy, but they've definitely been worth it. I think principle number 5, where time is valued as equally as money, is key for us. Y'all, we've all been like lifing a lot and balance is important. So when I hear time is valued as equally as money, I hear balance. That's what I hear. It's crucial to really value that, fully appreciating those folks who have multiple responsibilities and who contribute their time and their personal resources to marginalized communities. And in our case, with Forward Through Ferguson, those Black and Brown community members who are directly doing this work with the Racial Healing and Justice Fund, of giving money to healing justice initiatives, to community members. As much as we appreciate those who contribute money to our funders, yes, I said it, lived experience, right? That is value that shouldn't be placed on a hierarchy. That's life value. That is lived experience. And that's time. That's people's time here on earth, right? So in the case of the Racial Healing and Justice Fund, we offered stipends and honorariums to folks who participated throughout the engagement process. And even now that it's launched. But another thing that I am really, really proud of is our new Catalyst network with Forward Through Ferguson. It's an amazing network of intentional community of residents and partners who are volunteers and champions in advancing the systems and policy focused approach to really achieving racial equity in our region, and that we outlined in the Ferguson Commission report. So the short-term goal of the Catalyst Network is to really invite community members and partners to activate, like, yes, not use words, but actions around the key initiatives in Forward Through Ferguson's work, specifically Youth at the Center and Justice for All. We do have a long-term goal of the Catalyst Network of increasing the pipeline of community members with the skill and will to really have a systems level impact and make the St. Louis region, as far as racial equity, a vision of transform St. Louis a reality. This is a really amazing network. It works off of a point system. And I have to tell you a little bit about this point system because it seeks to value time, money, and influence equitably, right? So not to allow a person to simply buy their way into the network, but they got to do work, y'all. We want to set up the initial point system so that people continue to stay engaged and involved and support. And we actually launched this network at that fundraiser I told you about, Partners in Change.
Awesome, thank you. And David, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, sure. So I can talk about principles 8 and 9. So 8 is about promoting the understanding that everyone, donors, staff, funders, board members, volunteers, all of them personally benefits from engaging in the work of social justice. and that it's not just charity, it's a like fundamental human compassion. And I think that's really played out in kind of how the Ferguson Commission and all those community members started to think about racial equity work, because we always center the direct and traumatic, generationally traumatic impacts that inequity has on people of color, and white supremacy has on people of color, and particularly Black residents, Black and brown residents in St. Louis. But we always follow that up after we've centered people of color by saying we'd be remiss if we didn't name the very different but still present ways that white supremacy actually like cracks the humanity of white residents that are a part of it, that benefit from it, and then builds up to a regional level in how it makes St. Louis, for example, as a region, a less thriving place to be in general. There are studies that have found that our regional economy would have been $17 billion larger if we didn't have gaps in wages by race, right? There are incredible costs to the ways that we apportion benefit across our region that make us all worse off. And so we always start with like people of color, but then talk about the ways that this is like humanity work for all of us to be a part of, if we can do it in right relationship with each other. And then Principle 9 is about, we see the work of social justice as holistic and transformative, not transactional. Again, so there was this word that was in the charge that the governor created for the Ferguson Commission when he created it. We're convinced that it was like some intern who was like, oh yeah, this word sounds really sexy, we'll like put it in the charge. And then they were like, yeah, we'll sign off on this. But it actually turned out to become like a rallying cry and this like anchor of the work. And that work is unflinching. They said that the commission would take an unflinching look at the underlying conditions that led to the murder of Michael Brown Jr. And so that unflinching for us has really become like not just about what can we tear down. Like there's a really great quote, I think it's from Adrienne Marie Brown, about what it means to destroy versus to deconstruct. And so what does it mean to deconstruct and break down these systems that continue systemic racism? And also, what are we ready to build together, right? Like, how are we ready to become whole together? What's our vision for transformation, for a different arrangement of relationships, of resources, of life outcomes, so that we can all thrive and we get towards this idea of liberation? And so that's one of the ways that we've kind of tried to build that principle, not just as like something heady, but into our work and our practices when we're doing advocacy, fundraising, et cetera.
Awesome. And I'm putting my fundraiser hat on for a second, just to talk about principles 4 and 7 in relation to this. So all who engage in strengthening the community are equally valued, whether volunteer, staff, donor, or board member, as well as we foster a sense of belonging, not othering. There are a lot of people who want to be supportive and they don't know where to start. And so I think one of the most fun things that David and I were actually able to do this summer, as we were vaccinated, and David also got this pandemic puppy that needed to get out of the house. Like, we started meeting with donors who give us $5 and who give us $50,000 to be able to talk about what it meant for them to choose to support us and choose to just be a part of this work. And their stories of how they're creating change in their corner of the community is sort of what I think has also kept us going. Like, just the idea that people would share their wealth with us when the world has been in this, shaky and uncertain place has been really powerful. So helping people sort of find their place in this work and in this movement, I think has been exciting for me. So, okay, last question, and then we will go to the audience questions. What advice would you give other nonprofit staff considering community-centric fundraising as part of their fundraising efforts? David, I will start with you.
Yeah, I think when starting to embrace this role, three things come to mind. So first is like, build your team, and that doesn't mean just on your staff, like build your people, like get that network that's going to be there for you when it inevitably gets hard. And there's going to be hard moments. We're going to like face up against a lot of the structures that don't want this kind of movement for community-centric fundraising to happen. And so it's so important to have that like relationship of people that you can go back to and build up with. I think second, for executive directors, just think about the education that needs to happen like across the organization. And so how are you building people like across a nonprofit into the mission of it? To Rachel's point, from community members that you might be working with on actual advocacy or initiatives or services, through to staff members, like engaging staff members in the mission principles of it, and then also board, like really investing in the education and the awareness building to live into and have like a high tolerance for discomfort, because it will be uncomfortable as we're working towards a different model. And I had a third, but it's like completely blown my mind, or flown away. So I'll pass it on.
That is, yeah. Lady Ashley, go ahead. What advice would you give to other nonprofit staff considering CCF as part of their fundraising efforts?
Be curious, y'all. I would advise you to ask the same questions I asked myself more than once. First, who are you doing this work for? And in that answer, how can you decenter yourself and center those folks and their needs? Two, how do you hear community and act on their needs? And three, who is your community and who are you? Within this framework, because this work has to be done in a healthy way, it has to be reciprocal and understood on a level that's deeper than our history that evolved from a charity complex and therefore a white supremacist mindset. You know, once you answer these questions, how do you hold them with grace and push back? Because you will have to push back against others and your own mindset for them to thrive. So that would be my advice.
Awesome, thank you. And again, putting my fundraising hat on, build your squad, right? Like, we want to be able to do it. A lot of fundraisers are in a small shop. They're juggling a lot of things. And I love you, but it is not going to be just you and whatever heinous work week you agree to that are going to drive community-centric fundraising for your organization. So, you know, find the cheerleader on the program staff, find those volunteers, connect with the board members, right? Find a group of people who are who share your mindset, who share the idea that there is an abundance of resources, that your organization is doing work that deserves those resources, and that there's a place for you to start. And the other piece of it is like, be okay with failure. Like I don't say that lightly, right? Because sometimes failure feels like, oh my gosh, are the doors of my organization going to close, right? So we have to be calculated about our failure sometimes, but this work doesn't work if we're not uncomfortable and if we don't take a chance and if we don't live into this idea of radical trying and radical honesty with people that we're in relationship with. And so we have to be willing to scrape our knees a little bit and move forward in that. Okay, so we have, I think, about 13 minutes left, and I am going to move to the audience questions. And so far, they're really great. Okay, so let's see, David, I'm actually going to kick this first one to you. Actually, you both might be able to answer this, but anyway, okay. What do you see as the role of intra-community fundraising and racial justice work? How have local organizations in STL thought about managing potential new larger groups of individual small donors going forward? Are there lessons from this that should be shared to institutional foundations and ultra high net worth individuals?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there was a commissioner named Brittany Packnett who really, when Ferguson was starting to be created, I think believed in some of the, like, what were the origins of a lot of this thinking around community-centric fundraising, and was like, it's so important to have stake in the game with she was talking about like with Black people, that we are like in this together to advance. And that can be $1, like that can be 50 cents, like that can be like showing up for the event, but like, what does it mean for us to kind of build that power together and then activate on it for what we think are our priorities as a community. So
will you also talk about Kellogg?
Yeah, absolutely. So kind of one example of that, this is with the early childhood, is that
Yeah.
Is like going for big bets for funding, like collectively, like how are we thinking about like leveraging our resources in St. Louis together so that we can be stronger together and collaborate, versus having that kind of like competition that sometimes can happen within scarcity. And so on a number of times, and most recently with the Kellogg Foundation's kind of big bet funding that they recently released, built on some existing like grassroots work that had been happening in the early childhood sector, where providers had been organizing themselves to say, hey, we expect better from the state, we expect better from our local leaders. Our kids, our youth, are like birth to 5, need the investments of our resources because they are the future. And through that, we're able to like bring dozens of people together around a common application.
Cool, thanks, David. Okay, so our next question is, how have you successfully engaged the corporate sector to support this fundraising model? So I'm going to answer the first half of it, and then Lady Ashley, I think I want you to take the second part of it. So I would say that honestly, as long as Fort Ferguson has been an organization, it has not been a priority of ours to build relationships with the corporate sector. We have had a board member whose organization here in St. Louis has integrated anti-bias, anti-racism training into their corporate training. And so there was a very deep alignment with what they were trying to do in their organization with our work. And so they have made a multi-year commitment to the organization, and that has been wonderful. But as we have looked to some of our other corporate leaders across the community, you know, they may be willing to purchase Black Lives Matters t-shirts for their employees and then send their lobbyists to our state capitol to take away people's rights. And so that really has not been a place where we have, where we initially spent a lot of our fundraising efforts. When George Floyd was murdered, we received an outpouring of support from new corporate partners who were very excited to say publicly that they were interested in engaging with Fort Ferguson, who provided contributions to us, you know, no strings attached, general operating gifts. And David and I laid out this like incredible cultivation and stewardship plan where we connected with them in the fall. We gave them an update. We invited them to continue working with us, talking with us, connected them to community. And when we went back to ask for them to recommit to that same gift, that money was gone, right? Because it's not that great to give it when we're not getting attention for it. And so we found that there is a lot more work there. We're not going to let those folks off the hook when it comes to supporting the general operations of the organization. But we also know that some donors are not our donors. And we're not going to spend what precious time we have to chase dollars that are going to require us to show up differently or show up smaller in this work. So that's what I'll say about the general operations of FTF. Lady Ashley, as she shared earlier, manages a fund where a number of local entities put dollars into that. And I will let you address that piece of it.
Thank you. Yes, like David said earlier, we really lean into the practice and the mindset and the definition of being unflinching. What does that look like? What does unflinching look like when we have open conversations with the corporate sector about radical trust? What does it look like when we have conversations that are rooted in our values that are stated as forward through Ferguson? Specifically, I'll give you an example with the Racial Healing and Justice Fund. A lot of funders, predominantly white, wanted to know what our funding priorities were before we had a chance to engage community and ask them what funding priorities should be. What did they need to thrive? What did they need to heal? What did they need for justice? And we had to have a really honest conversation. I had to put on my facilitator hat as a director of community partnerships and say, not knowing is often not afforded to many Black and Brown folks. Being able to know your priorities, to know what success looks like, is often the benefit of coming from a place of identity privilege, right? So what does it look like to radically trust Black and Brown people and their values and say, give us your money and we will decide what's right for it? I know you've probably heard of WWJD, like I have WWWDI. What we will not do is tell people how they should thrive, how they should heal. And what we will do is listen and continue to have honest, unflinching conversations with our organization that are rooted and based in our values, because they come from within our identities and we know what we need. So it's about trust and it's about leaning into that discomfort. And I'm really grateful that our team continues to do that.
Thank you, Lady Ashley. All right, David, a question for you, which like harkens back to the time we've spent with like chart paper in my dining room. Have you explored working in an alternative model to the nonprofit structure? Can community-centric fundraising be best practice outside of the nonprofit complex and its burdens and best practices?
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely in those dining room chart paper times, back to like the founding of the organization, there was just kind of like a reticence, or it was, they knew what would come with it. And they knew what the limitations of it would be for what, like to Lady Ashley's point, like community members said would need to be done, and the limitations on that kind of advocacy, that kind of activity that come with a 501c3. And so initially they really did think about models of like investment that yield returns for communities, and have a way that centered that in like Black ownership. Thought about their like benefit corporations and other models of being, and eventually chose the nonprofit, but it's been consistently part of our thinking, like, what is our future like? What is a transformative way that we can arrange what is available to us to create what we know are the priorities? And that led to some of our dreaming and what ultimately became part of like our structural innovation like strategy plan, which really is what a lot of organizations, advocacy organizations, are leaning into. But part of that began with the Racial Healing and Justice Fund, right? The creation of community governed bodies that are connected to Forward Through Ferguson, but are not like created just to benefit us, that further the mission of the work and dismantling white supremacy, systemic racism, and eventually could look like creating and utilizing things like PACs in ways where the members of that PAC are community members, are Black and Brown community members that then can advocate in political change. And then a lot of the traditional tools like C4s and others, but thinking about how do we arrange these with community governance built in, and community participation built into them. And that's where we're kind of have our eye on the horizon as we grow as an organization.
Thank you for that, David. And last question from my pal Marcus in Austin. Hey, Marcus. The community-centric fundraising community itself is building a movement to transform philanthropy at large in the ways that we've described today. As movement leaders, what do you all recommend as the top things to keep in mind as the community-centric fundraising movement grows?
Did you want to answer, Marcus, first?
You're funny. Wow. Okay. So, I mean, here's what I'm even nervous to be called a movement leader. I'll be honest with you. I think that there is, obviously so much work to do, so much deconstructing, so much dismantling, so much relearning, unlearning that, I most days I'm not sure that I know anything, but what's true is that I've worked to surround myself with people who share my values and have found their place in this work. And so I think the thing to keep in mind is that this is something that is going to grow and change and evolve. And the point of it at the end of the day, for me at least, is to recognize that the system in which our organizations function were not built for our success. So it's not going to be the tools that built this work that are going to somehow help our organizations meet their mission, right? We're not just going to somehow spontaneously move from harm reduction to systems change. It is going to be an intentional, calculated, thoughtful process that involves a lot of people and a lot of talent and a lot of skill. And that I might be the face today, but I'm hoping that the 101 people that are on this call now are going to be faces for this work as we move forward, because it is not going to be literally 5'10" 3/4 Rachel D'Souza Siebert in St. Louis, Missouri, right? That is going to be able to take up enough space to get the attention we need to start to move this work forward. Okay, so that's my pitch here. But Lady Ashley, now I'll kick it to you.
Thank you. I want to back that up. I think it's really important to know where we've come from, right? And that means the positive and the negative. Fundraising and philanthropy does not have a positive history, right? So we have to acknowledge that and name it. So when it's time to move away from it, we can, and continue to realize that this is people-based. People are the base.
Awesome. David, one last closing remark, and then I think we're shutting it down.
First, that you're 5'4" of like tenacity and drive and vision and amazingness, first of all. And then I think the thing to think about is just like capacity building of people that often don't have a lot of investment. Like I've seen movements grow before that can, get so big, but haven't invested in the people to do the work like on the ground level. And so I don't know, in nonprofit work and anti-racism work, there's just so many things and we're doing it at low capacity. And so what does it mean to like create space for those people to like build their capacity and vision and growth to then do the work? So what does making that space look like?
Thanks all. I will turn it back to the Upswell crew.
And that would be me. And I just want to echo the incredible gratitude that I'm seeing fly in the chat to the three of you for just a remarkable conversation where you're able to, in real time, make sense of really powerful, adaptive, innovative experience of integrating fundraising, community change, and a community-centric way of sharing power. And at the same time, being able to show up and really very constructively say to philanthropy, let's work differently. And we're willing to put in enormously hard work. And I'm so glad, Lady Ashley, you talked about time as a resource and self-care throughout that process. It's just fantastic. So Lady Ashley, David, Rachel, thank you for your willingness to share really nationally and publicly the extraordinary work, which I know is long days and lonely work at times. And it's just an honor to have listened to you all for the last 45 minutes. Really great.